This video records one of the most beautiful moments in Indian history. It records the exact moment the British left India for the last time. But why did the British leave India? You might think it was because of this man. And you would be wrong. Sure, Gandhi launched the Quit India movement in 1942, but the British had squashed that movement by 1943, just as surely as I'm squashing this raspberry. Yummy. You might think that the British left India because they had no money to stay in India after the Second World War, and you would be wrong. Sure, the British owed India 1.3 billion sterling pounds at the end of the Second World War, and that's a lot of money. But remember, the British controlled colonies like the Malaya and the Gold Coast, and these were very lucrative. The British made billions of dollars exporting rubber and tin from the Malaya colonies to the United States. So then why did the British left India? If you said it was because of the Indian Naval Rebellion of 1946, you would be right. In 1947, Winston Churchill, who had lost the election after the Second World War, wrote to the Prime Minister Attlee and he charged him with the shameful and hasty departure of the British from India. But Attlee said, "Hold your horses, Winston," and he quoted Claude Auchinleck, who was the Commander General of the Armed Forces in India, and Auchinleck had written a secret letter to the Chiefs of Staff in which he had said, "Most Indian officers in the army are nationalists." And Auchinleck said if the Indian forces as a whole cease to be reliable, then the British cannot do anything to keep control in the country. So what was this Indian Naval Rebellion? How did it begin? If you think of the Indian Naval Rebellion as a fire, what was the spark? The spark happened in 1944 when Subhash Chandra Bose started the Indian National Army, or the INA, in Singapore to fight against the British. There were these three Indian officers and they left the British Army and they joined Subhash Chandra Bose. And the British charged them with high treason. Now, because I'm a legal scholar, I can tell you that high treason is the highest form of treason. It has high right in the name. And this spark caused by the trial of these three officers lit the flame that was the Indian Naval Rebellion. But to learn more about the Indian Naval Rebellion, there's this amazing book written by B.C. Dutt, who actually started the rebellion. And B.C. Dutt was born in the small village in West Bengal in India. B.C. Dutt had this mentor in his village and he said, "Hey, you know what? Look, there's the Second World War starting and there's a ton of money being poured into it. Why don't you join the armed forces and become a part of the empire and make money at the expense of the empire?" And B.C. Dutt writes how happy he was to get this job in the Navy. But soon he got very, very upset and angry. Why? Because he saw instantly during training that the British white soldiers and the Indians were treated very differently. The British officers were getting paid 5 to 10 times more than the Indians. They had better accommodation than the Indians. And they were allowed to use the facilities of the Indian soldiers whenever they wanted, but the Indians couldn't even go near where the British soldiers stayed. So it was just like economy class and business class. Now something happened that made BC Dutt even more angry. What? Well, this happened when the actual war operations kicked off and they traveled to the war front in a train. And the Indians were stuffed in a small compartment, 45 people in a small compartment, and they didn't even have space to move their arms and legs. So basically just like economy class without the peanuts. But the British and the Australians, each member got their own private booth. And anytime they arrived at a station, the British were taken out for these very hot meals. And the Indians, they were made to eat something called bully beef. Now, I'm not going to Google what bully beef is because I don't want to learn more about any food that has bully in the name. And so when the Indians came back to Bombay, they started asking themselves these questions. Is it just enough to be professionally excellent at what you do? Who am I fighting for? Why am I giving my life up for the British Empire? So all these cadets, they began to band together in the canteen of the HMS Talwar. And they all said, you know what? Navy Day is coming up on December 1. Let's show the British what we are made of. Navy Day is this day when the British invite the public and high-ranking officers to show what an amazing job has been done. But BC Dutt and his colleagues, they burnt stuff and they threw burnt debris all over the place. They had banners that said "Quit India" and they put up these banners on the ship. So the British Navy Day was What's the word I'm looking for? Successful? Memorable? Oh, embarrassing. But BC Dutt soon got caught and he told the British, hey, you can put me in front of a firing squad. But the British knew what had happened with the INA. Now, to get back to the trial of the INA officers, the British had censored the news of this trial, but it had begun to leak out, and now the general public had become aware of these three Indian officers being put on trial, and it caused a lot of unrest. And the British didn't want a similar unrest breaking out again. So they called this guy Commander King and they said, go speak to the naval cadets and sort everything out. King could have used words like, please, nice to meet you, and tell me more. But instead, he used words like, you junglies and you sons of bitches. And the cadets got even more upset. BC Dutt and his friends had started this rebellion, but they saw that it would soon peter out. But then they did something incredible that really sent the rebellion onto next gear. What did they do? Well, you remember how I said Gandhi would be making a great comeback in this video, and here's that moment. So BC Dutt and his colleagues thought to how Gandhi had broken the salt tax. So he had basically marched to Dandi and he had made salt from seawater. Now, what was great about that moment, that it was a very concrete moment that you could wrap your mind around. And they decided to do the same thing. And they thought, hey, what can we protest about? And the answer came readily to them. Food. The food served in the canteen. Remember, bully beef? On February 18, 1946, 1,500 cadets said, we are not going to eat anymore. And they went on a strike. And very soon, all 11 shore establishments in Bombay lowered the Union Jack. Now, where did these Indian cadets get this resolve? Why were they able to launch a successful rebellion when scores of rebellions had failed in the past? And that gives this beautiful reason. He says, we had grown up with the British telling us, hey, whites are better than you. But then they traveled the world during World War II. They fought alongside the whites. And then they saw, hey, there's nothing special about these whites. That is why they had the self-confidence to persist with the rebellion. And the word began to spread. The free press broke the news. All India Radio covered the rebellion. Even the BBC covered the rebellion. And the public got wind of what was going on. So they started coming near the HMS Talwar with food. The cadets now had complete control of the HMS Talwar, including the ammunitions. And then the British called this contingent of the Indian Army to go and fight them. And the Indian Army went near the HMS Talwar. They raised their guns. And then BC Dutt made an announcement. Brothers, why do you think we are fighting? We are not doing it for our comfort. We are doing it for our motherland, the same motherland that gave birth to you. And all the Indian soldiers in the army said, hey, you know what? What are we doing? Why are we fighting these people? And they put down their arms. But then the British did something truly horrible. This time they sent the army made up of white soldiers. And the white soldiers actually took to the streets with tanks and used the tanks to kill these people. More than 200 people died and thousands were injured. This was the only time in all of the time the British were in India that the British had used tanks against civilians on the streets. The protest spread all the way up to Karachi. Now you would think that these cadets were going to win the rebellion, but they lost. Why? This was because they didn't get support from leadership of the Congress and the Muslim League. The Indian leader Vallabhbhai Patel said that this rebellion by the cadets has caused this unfortunate tension. Gandhi didn't even want to hear about the rebellion. He said if the cadets were so unhappy with the food, they should have just resigned. Gandhi didn't want anything to do with an act that was associated with violence. And Jinnah gave this great speech from Karachi, and he said words to the effect of, we understand why the cadets are upset, but we don't want the situation to escalate further, and I plead with the cadets, particularly the Muslims, to put down their arms. BC Dutt writes very movingly of this great brotherhood between Hindus and Muslims. He said that the words of the Congress and Jinnah didn't make any sense to the ratings because the Hindus and Muslims, we had spent time in each other's company for the best years of our lives. But the words of the political leaders had split the ranks of the cadets, and they got divided, and the back of the rebellion was soon broken. But the deed was done. The British saw that the Indian armed forces were no longer in their control, and they could not maintain control over the country for any longer period of time. And that's why in 1947, they decided to leave the country. So well done, naval cadets. With that, we come to the end of this episode. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'm going to be doing a bunch of videos on Indian history, mythology, and Buddhism. If that's the kind of thing you enjoy, please consider subscribing for this channel. I hope you have a great week and enjoy the next 7 days that lie ahead. Bye.